Welcome to the MOOC on Public Policy. I am Dr. Shaji. I am a faculty member in the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. Today we are going to talk about regulatory reforms and independent regulation, emergence of new public policy. It's part of the larger discussion on institutions and its impact on public policy making. Independent regulation has emerged as a new form of public policy in most of the developing countries in the post-globalization phase. When you look at the word regulation, it means a rule. The Oxford English Dictionary defines regulate as to control or direct by means of rules and restrictions. Broadly, regulation implies the whole realm of legislation, governance, and social control. Regulation of the industry or any sector is a process prescribed by laws which controls or directs some decision of firms, utilities in the public interest. It is actually considered to be a substitute for a market with perfect competition, in the sense that market ensures balancing of the interest of the consumers and the interest of provider of goods or services. In the absence of perfect market competition, it is often considered that independent regulation can bring about drastic changes in any sector or any field of industry. Introduction of independent regulation in that sense has become a new public policy initiative. It is often known as regulatory reforms in most of the countries, especially in the post-globalization phase. Now, if you look at the concepts pertaining to regulation or independent regulation refers to a governing mechanism which is independent, remain equidistant, all service providers and stakeholders, including the government, to discharge its duties. There are three major attributes for regulatory independence for any independent regulatory body. The three major attributes of regulatory independence are arm's length relationship with regulated firms, consumers, and other private interest. Second, arm's length relationship with the government and bureaucracy, and there is organizational autonomy. In a way, the independent regulation is found to be very effective in all infrastructure sectors worldwide, generally based on the criteria such as coherence, predictability, capacity, independence, accountability, and transparency. Independent regulatory authorities have come up in a big way in most of the states, especially in the developing countries in the recent times. The main characteristic of independent regulation is that it is performed not by state authorities but by independent regulatory bodies. Now, if you look at various models for regulatory reforms and the regulations, this particular kind of reforms have to be seen in the overall context of the emergence of new public management. And there is also a phenomenon of shift from the welfare state to regulatory state. In that context, regulatory reforms have become a new model. If you look at some of the models for regulatory reforms or independent regulation, one can see broadly three models. The first one is called the top-down model, which explains the advancement of regulatory reforms as a response of national policy makers to exogenous and often common pressures from various international sources on national policy communities. For instance, the role of aid and trade bodies from the international arena contributing to the shaping of regulatory reforms in the developing countries. Another important model is bottom-up model, which explains the advancement of regulatory reforms as a response to the domestic balance of power and a specific national style. In other words, it actually responds to the demands from the internal setting of a country. And the third model is basically the one which is called the contagious process model, which actually implies the incorporation of regulatory reforms into one country's public policy making as a kind of response to or as a kind of learning from the other countries in the system. In other words, the contagious model talks about how policy communities share their knowledge and execute the best practices. Now, there are several perspectives on the origin of regulation. First of all, it is believed that the governments intend to overcome information asymmetries with business actors and in aligning the business interest with government interest. Another important perspective on the origin of regulation is that customers' desire for protection from market power when competition is non-existent or ineffective. The third perspective is that the business actors in any sector would desire for protection from rivals. And the fourth perspective is that which is actually a normative understanding of a regulation, which implies for the view that regulators can be instrumental in encouraging competition wherever feasible. The points that we were talking about so far are on the following lines. The regulatory reforms have emerged as new form of public policy in most of the developing countries, which is actually a kind of imitation of models which are prevalent in the advanced developed countries. So, there are several models for the incorporation of regulatory reforms or independent regulation to the domestic settings, public policy settings of developing countries. The first one is the top down approach, which talks about how the exogenous factors, the international or systemic level factors influencing the policy reforms, regulatory reforms. The second one is the emergence of regulatory reforms as a response to the demands from the domestic setting. And the third one is a contagious process model, which discusses the sharing of best practices among the public policy communities cutting across national boundaries. In a way, the regulatory reforms or the emergence of independent regulation has emerged as a kind of a strategy to overcome the information asymmetry and for the protection of the interest of consumers, and also to create a level playing field for the business actors, and also it is an attempt to promote competition in different fields. In the next section, we are going to talk about the background of regulatory reforms or independent regulation at the global arena, and subsequently we would take up Indian experience.